So, I've decided to start Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. I should explain, actually, if you're new to this channel, what I typically do in these started videos is I explain why I picked up a particular book. In other words, why the subject matter appeals to me or why the book caught my eye. I usually don't have anything intelligent to say at the book at this point because I haven't read the book yet. So I just go into some background about my own personal interests. Or in other words, consider yourself warned. There's a high possibility I might not say anything of general interest in this video, but I'm gonna go ahead anyways. So yeah, mythology. I was a huge Greek mythology fan when I was an adolescent, you know, like around 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, huge into Greek mythology. I never got into Norse mythology, and I attributed it at the time to just the fact that I was busy reading up on Greek mythology. And I think when you're sucked into a particular area of interest, it's often easier to keep going down that rabbit hole than it is to pull out and go into something completely different. If you're already vaguely familiar with the Greek mythological world and the characters, the barrier to entry is much less. So, you know, if you pick up a book on the Trojan War, you're like, all right, I already vaguely know who these Greek gods are. I have some background for some of these heroes. Makes it easier to keep reading. At least for me, maybe this is a personality thing. Maybe some people have a personality that predisposes them to kind of keep following an area of interest, and some people have a personality that predisposes them to read more widely. But I was always predisposed to keep following a particular area of interest. I did pick up 1 or 2 books on Norse mythology just from the local school library. And I remember trying to read through it and just not being interested. Like, who is this Loki guy? Who is this Thor guy? Where are the gods and goddesses I'm used to from Greek mythology? I wonder a bit now, actually. I didn't think this at the time, but I wonder a bit now if perhaps the tone of Norse mythology was a bit different, and perhaps that threw me off. I don't know, and I haven't read enough Norse mythology to say, but sometimes I get the impression that, you know, with the Greek mythology, and especially all the literature that comes down to us, we know quite a bit of detail about the epics. So, you know, the Orestian trilogy or something like that, you know these characters in real depth, and you kind of feel like they're in the room with them. Where at least Norse mythology, and again I'm saying this as somebody who really hasn't dug into it yet, but Norse mythology seems a lot more weird and maybe more vague. I don't know, and maybe by the time I finish this book I'll have a much clearer understanding of it. But for one reason or another, it didn't grab me when I was young, and I've never gone back to it. I have become, though, in the years since, vaguely aware of a bit of an interesting paradox, which is Greek and Roman mythology is much more well known. I mean, people know much more about Hercules and Zeus and Hera and Apollo than they do about the Norse myths. The paradox is the Norse myths seem to have a much stronger influence on our culture. I mean, the days of the week, of course, are named after the Norse gods. Or actually, it's half and half. Actually, this is a bit of a tangent, but this is interesting to me. I looked this up on Wikipedia at one point, and the English calendar is notable for being like this strange mixture of German mythology and Latin mythology. You know, because Saturday is named after the Roman god Saturn. But the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday are named after the Norse gods. And so it, you know, it's, I mean, if you go to like the French or Spanish calendar, sorry, not calendar, days of the week, it's all consistent, and that's all named after Latin gods. But then if the English calendar is like this strange mix. Okay, sorry, that was a digression. Norse mythology is very influential. It's where we get the days of our week. And also the modern fantasy genre, the one that produces all those paperbacks you see in bookstores under the fantasy section, is I think much more influenced by Norse mythology than it is by Greek mythology, right? And I think Tolkien probably has a big influence on this. But if you pick up a fantasy book nowadays, it's less likely to have things like centaurs and satyrs and the various creatures from Greek mythology, and much more likely to have the characters from Norse mythology, with the dwarves, the elves, which I believe originate from Norse mythology, but perhaps come into the fantasy genre through their connection with German folklore. Again, I'm somewhat talking outside of my area of expertise, but I guess the general point being, I became vaguely aware that the modern fantasy genre, as it's established nowadays, owes more to Norse mythology than it does to Greek mythology, even though paradoxically Greek mythology is much more well known in terms of the stories of Greek mythology. And then, of course, the other thing that's pushed Norse mythology onto my radar the past few years is the same thing that's put it onto everyone's radar, which is these Marvel films. And yeah, it's interesting because, like, when I picked up that Norse mythology book years ago when I was a kid, you do get kind of a vague sense of it, but having it on the movie screen forces you to imagine it in a much more vivid way than if you're just kind of flipping through a collected tales of Norse mythology. At least for me, the mythology books that I picked up as a kid, I don't think I absorbed fully the strangeness of it. Partly because when you're flipping through a book, unless you're reading it very carefully, it's quite easy to just gloss over things and not maybe take the time to fully imagine it. And I suppose if I had been into the Thor comics, which I wasn't particularly as a kid, then maybe Kirby was doing this way back when in the comic book world. But yeah, now it's on screen. And you see Asgard and the Rainbow Bridge and the guy guarding the bridge, what's his name? You kind of see all this strangeness on the screen where you're fully visualizing it. And then there was that Thor movie, Ragnarok, which, like a lot of people, when that movie came out, I had heard the word Ragnarok before. I knew like heavy metal bands would use that word or something like that. But I had really no idea what it meant. And then when that movie Thor Ragnarok was all over popular culture, then I finally looked up what Ragnarok really meant, and I thought, wow, this is really strange. I mean, these Norse myths are just so strange and in a somewhat intriguing way. Like, do people actually believe this? With this whole mythology built around this? I'd be interested in reading up about this more. I saw this book, Neil Gaiman's Norse Mythology, in an airport a couple years ago. And it's one of those things where I flipped through it, I'm like, maybe. And I didn't buy it at the time. And I've regretted that since. And I should explain, I'm living in Asia now, which makes it a little bit hard to track down books. I mean, once every couple of years I go back home and then I can load up on books. But otherwise it's a little bit hard to find stuff. And I regretted not picking this up at the airport a couple of years ago. And since then, whenever I go into a bookstore, I've kind of been looking and seeing if they have this. And then, sure enough, just a couple of weeks ago, I stumbled upon this in one of the bookstores in Vietnam. And I thought, okay, definitely going to buy it this time. Neil Gaiman, I'm ashamed to say, I have not read many of his books. I've read Good Omens, which probably doesn't count because that was co-written with Terry Pratchett. And I've also read American Gods, which I didn't love. I didn't hate it, and if you've seen my review, and I've reviewed it on this channel, I gave it a mixed review. There were some things about it I liked, and then there were some things about it I thought were a little bit of a slog to get through. So, yeah, but I know he's a very well-liked author, so I'm definitely due for giving him another chance. In addition to that, this book was recommended to me by a commenter in my review of Thor Ragnarok. In my review of that movie, I talked about what I had just been talking about previously, namely that I had been looking Ragnarok up on Wikipedia, and wow, wasn't it some crazy stuff. Commentator Tom, who occasionally comments on this channel, said, yeah, Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology is a very readable account of the Norse myths. So I've also been meaning to pick this up ever since I got that comment. And Tom, if you're watching this, thanks for that comment. I don't believe I ever replied to it at the time. But I am picking this book up in part because of your recommendation. So I was listening. And I think that's really all I have to say at this stage. When I've finished the book, and when I finish the book, I'll come back with a proper review, and hopefully at that time I'll have more intelligent things to say.